Hi guys, Anthony again with Austin Historical Weapons Guild here with Andreas. And as always, we are back to talking about Jude Lew, working straight from the book, reading it blind along with everyone else, and just kind of giving first glance, first interpretations of what he's talking about. Tonight, starting on page 165 with Absetsin. So from the Zettel, learn Absetsin, setting off, artfully foil strikes and thrusts. Your point will hit the one who thrust against you, and his point will be broken by yours. Hit from both sides each time you want to step. Item. Note. When you approach him in the Zufecten, and he's standing against you as if he wanted to thrust at you, set your left foot forward and position yourself in the flug on the right side. Give him an opening on your left side. When he thrusts against your opening, wind your sword to your left side, the short edge at his sword against his thrust. Set it off so that your point is standing against him. Step forward with your right foot and thrust indes to his face or chest. So first thing I'm going to call out is that indes word is there again, which we just spent, he gave us a whole page talking about that. And that's that idea of as the swords clash, as everything's happening, all this is. So even though this reads very step by step, play by play, everything needs to be happening much faster than the text can make it sound. So other than that, this is pretty straightforward. This is a pretty straightforward flug reaction that most people start and learn. So if Andreas looks like he wants to thrust me, that can be flug, that can be ox. I don't really care. It doesn't matter. All I'm going to do, I'm going to approach. I'm going to give him my left side, make that an opening, say, go on, give it a shot. And I'm sitting in flug against him. As he thrusts, I'm going to wind across. And I really need to make sure, and this is the hard part, is I'm getting my false edge against this, right? I'm not sitting here. Everyone wants to do the long edge because it's easier to make that transition. I really need to roll almost 180 degrees with my sword to set this off. And I'm sure Andreas can vouch the difference between my long edge here and me rolling to my false edge there is a lot of stretch, a lot of power. And I can't promise to understand why that is or what that is. And I bet I could, if I really wanted to get tricky, I could draw my hand around my sword to make the displacement, but that's, in my opinion, super not worth it. So all I'm really doing is he comes in, I'm turning this all the way across, really engaging my hips, my back leg to turn me through, make that connection. Once I have this is my cue for indes. I'm really stepping and thrusting through, right? So very important. I am not, as he thrusts, stepping into this, right? Because this is exactly what happens and Andreas has a heart attack. I need to make sure as this happens, I'm turning my false edge out, turning out, notice I'm even engaging my front leg to turn my hips faster to make this displacement. Now I can drive myself through with that step, with that thrust. So pretty straightforward. So moving right along. Item, another piece. When you are standing in the flug on the right side and he strikes to your left side, above to your opening, go up with your sword and wind to your left side against his strike. Your hilt in front of your head into the ox. With this, step forward with your right foot and thrust at his face or chest. Do these pieces as well from your left side from the flug. So basically, the last line, as on left, same on right. So we're going to skip that over because it's not super exciting, super interesting. But looking at the thrust and the thrust counter and the thrust reaction from there. So he wants us to wind up against the strike, hilt in front of your head into the ox. So we're going to our ox guard from the flug guard, full across our body. It doesn't give us an edge to work against. It doesn't do anything else explicit like that. So there's definitely a little bit to kind of think about what I'm playing with. So working from here, as he throws his cut, first thing I'm going to do, it's not the same exact thing, but instead of staying low in flug, I'm rising up to ox. Same full hip twist, everything else. I'm using that same cue from before. As the swords clash, I'm waiting for that to happen before I step and move. So again, I turn through, and I drive after the bind, slightly missing Andreas's face. But you can see that works really strongly, really well. Just for the sake of thoroughness, I'm going to bind into my long edge this time, just so we kind of see what happens with that. So already struggling much more against this to drive through. And my step, should it happen, resist. Like I don't even get to make my step. So clearly it's very important working from our left side. We're getting that false edge fully rotated over, fully rotated to catch that displacement. If I don't make it and wind up more on my flat and wind up here, I'm still okay because I'm actually displacing and overbinding and winding because I'm pushing through so hard. So it kind of indirectly gets to my false edge. So you can kind of get away with it, almost cheat a little bit, but really make sure you get that as much of that rotation as you can to make that false edge connection that we're looking for. And incidentally, ironically or not, like this is kind of the Shielhao position, right? We're gonna like that Shielhao being this kind of long extended position here. My false edge is down, my false is engaged. We're getting a lot of those same structural benefits with a Shielhao as a cut that we do from the Absetsin as a wind, for lack of a real word. So we're kind of coming across. He wants us up nice and high into ox, you know, keep everything safe, keep everything covered, and then we drive through and out and follow after. But it's definitely worth noting that this is a consistency we're seeing in this system, that when we want to offset actions, we're using that false edge across our body and things like that. Anything else we didn't talk about? All right. Moving on. Learn Durchwechsel. We talked about this earlier. The changing through. Thrust and wound from both sides. He who binds on you will be clearly cut or found by changing through. Item. Know that there are many different ways of Durchwechsel, which can be done from every strike against those fencers who strike to the sword and cut not to the openings of the man. You should learn to execute these very carefully so that your opponent is not setting on against you while you are changing through. So onsets, and if you remember, setting on was thrusting to the openings to make actions and kind of deliver wounds and attacks from there. So we now know that as you Durchwechsel, if your motion is too large, your opponent should just be stabbing you straight through and kind of ignoring that action at all, because as you thrust, as we saw with the Ansetsin, you're able to set aside attacks, push things across, and kind of work from there. We see very similar things in Rapier as well. All right, so item. Do the Durchwechsel as follows. If you approach him in the Zufectum, strike above long to his head. When he strikes against you towards the sword and not to your body, let your point drop with the strike and change through before he binds on your sword and thrust to the other side. If he notices the thrust and follows it with the sword with a displacement, then again change through to the other side. Do this always on both sides when he is going against your sword with a displacement. All right, so this is pretty straightforward and probably one of the more difficult things to actually see and feel when you're actually fencing. So one of the important things here is, well, two things, right? First of all, I'm going to be fencing long, right? We haven't talked much about this other than, again, the Shielhao, if your fence is short before you. But I want to make sure if I'm doing some nice, long, extended cuts, otherwise, for whatever reason, the Durchwechsel is not going to work as well. The difficulty, as I said, is I need to see in that split second of, is he cutting at me or is he cutting at my blade, right? So as he goes to cut, I need to see what he's cutting at, what's happening. If I can see he's cutting at my sword, I need to somehow magically get around below it and then stab into the other side. And I know I kind of hinted at this before, but to go really deep into this, I have a version that I like to do, which people have reached out and said they do very similar as well, which is always nice. So I appreciate that. But instead of kind of doing this drop, Olympic fencing style parry, which is incredibly hard to do with a cut, right? If I throw a cut in earnest and I try to drop it, I'm really fighting myself an entire way. So instead of kind of trying to drop this, I'm going to take advantage of something they emphasize, those long arms. I'm going to retract them and pull them in and let myself kind of pull back. So here I'm going to pull in. So this isn't quite enough because I stopped, right? I get stuck, crouched. If I let this swing underneath and go back basically through ox, If you read Meyer into almost a Schlussel-like position, somewhere between the two, then this becomes a much, much faster transition to work out of. So again, I feel the cut, and now, as I go through Ox or Schlussel or whatever in between, I'm able to very easily thrust through. And if he sees my Dirk-Wechsel and presses off against my new thrust, right, I can do the same exact thing to the other side, or also even the same side, depending on the pressure he's giving me. If he's giving me a little bit of pressure, I can just come back through. If he's pushing really hard off against it, I can change out the other side just as easily and make those thrusts happen. This also helps defeat the setting on the onsets in that he might do as well, right? If he throws a kind of half cut and leaves it out, and I've really dropped my sword, he's going to drop that point right in before I can come back up and recover. If I really work that kind of narrow opening, right, now I can realize like, oh, I need this after all, or I've come out, I can start pressing around to cover, and I have a lot more options to keep myself safe, as well as just the action overall is much simpler and much easier. I'll be curious to see as we go through the more of the Dirk-Wechsel plays, because there are a lot of them slipping through, if this holds up as well, or if I need to modify this to make it kind of work with the techniques they're describing. All right, so moving on. Item, another Dirk-Wechsel. When you approach him in the Zufechtem, set your left foot forward and hold your long point against his face. When he strikes from above or from below to your sword, in order to strike away or to bind at it, let your point drop downward and thrust toward the other side. Do this against all strikes. All right, so this is everyone's, I like to call it, it's definitely a new bait type move, right? I'm sitting here, actually my left foot's forward. I'm here, he strikes on my sword, I change, and I drop. And these, I'm totally fine with being these little quick little dips because I'm extension everything else. That being said, totally valid. I drop there. It's a much, much shorter action, much, much quicker way of like driving that attack in against him. He cuts from a blow or from the other side, right? Same thing starts to happen. So I need to get better against those. But which direction I should be doing this against? But quickly becomes a very simple, very point-forward game. So with this kind of application from the long point, because the attacks are so small, because your sword's static, you can totally do a disengage from living fencing if you don't want to practice this thing. Again, I just like it because it likes to keep my sword nice, focused, centered, nice and straight. I'm not giving up my long point position, right? If I come down here and he throws that half cut, he's now in long point and I'm not. It's not something I want to happen. So I like to make sure that point is forward, that point's creating pressure by itself that I can control and kind of work from there. So moving on. Item, note this piece exactly. That's a new phrase. When he is displaced or bound at your sword in any way, he does not hold the point of a sword against an opening of your body, but rather points it laterally to one side, then change through bravely. But if he remains with his point in front of your face or against an opening, do not change through and stay at his sword. Work toward the nearest opening, and you will not be able to do either a Nachreisen or an Ansetzen. So that's kind of just highlighting what we've been talking about before. The thing that caught my attention, I don't know if you caught this, change through bravely. That's the second time I've read that word, and that comes back from the Schielhau break of long point, where you sprint to the point and take the throat without fear, right? I guess it's not bravely, but it's definitely a very distinct phrase that's not something we see a lot of. So, I mean, I don't feel like there's anything to really talk about with that other than more of the same, right? So again, this is just one of those, how aware am I of where his point is and what's going on? So if we're to bind here, if his sword is not at an opening, which is not right now, right? If he's pushing hard, I could change through. I don't care what's going to happen. Take that strike. However, if he is pointed towards my face like this, even though we're out of distance, I don't want to disengage at all, even this one, because he's easily able to. That was a nice knock, Ryzen. Right, where he just followed after my strike, followed after my action with my sword, shut off my attack. So this just becomes this game of like, he's online, now he's not, now I can change through, and I'm safe. And again, the more we kind of play in these deep situations, I really feel that this type of action starts feeling borderline ludicrous. So just kind of throwing that out there, really just work on this as a really nice option way of doing the Dirk Vexel. There is times and places where this is easier or better, but even here, if I'm creating this space, this really makes him work a lot more. And then we're kind of, again, we're back to the Shielhao position. So change through bravely. All right, moving on to Zukin. We're getting farther than I thought we would. Step closer in the bind. Zukin, jerking, gives good findings. Jerk, if he hits, jerk again. Find work that hurts him. Jerk in every encounter if you want to mock the masters. And that's kind of one of my favorite phrases now. Jerk in every encounter if you want to mock the masters. Is that how you translate Zukin?
Original translation is nani nani nana while you do it.
Yeah. But is jerking a good Zukin?
Yeah, jerk it back. So yeah, in this particular thing, it's usually something very fast, like if you would touch a hot stove.
Got it. So that's great context to have, right? So just to make sure everyone heard, like Zukin says the German is a kind of, if you've hit a hot stove, that kind of twitch jerk back reaction is what the Zukin should be. Whatever that means right now, we don't know. All right. Know that the Zukin shall be done against those masters who bind strongly to the sword in the displacement, as well as those who remain at the sword and wait for you to strike or to leave the bind. All right. So they're binding to displace, or they're just remaining on the sword and wait for someone to leave. If you want to trick these masters or to fool them, do a Zukin against them in the following way. Strike strongly from your right side above towards the head. If he goes up in order to displace, so he's not cutting, he's just kind of rising up into ox or crown or some other similar position. If he goes up in order to displace, jerk your sword towards you before he can bind at it and thrust toward the other side. Do this every time the swords come together. Yeah, it sounds like mockery. All right, so strike strongly. If he goes up, jerk your sword toward you. All right, so that's always the eternal question of what does jerk your sword towards you mean? So nice and slow, I throw my cut. He's putting it, set it aside more, don't stab me. So I need to pull it towards me. And the question always is, do I pull before the bind happens? Or do I pull back from when I came, from when the bind happens? Because I'm supposed to be thrusting, right? Jerk your sword towards you before you can bind at it and thrust towards the other side. I really feel like it's pulling along the path of the blade, not the path it came back from. Not to mention, if I've done a good, hard, strong cut, like I mean it, like I'm not gonna like pull that back with any kind of regularity, but I can definitely drop into that kind of pre-cut motion. So see what happens. Because while you're still waiting for that cut to come out, I've definitely made my own thrust. Right? If I start adding fancy footwork, things I don't really mention because I don't want to give us a lot to work up out of this, just right there, I've got that straight in. Well, he's way off target. So moving on, see what else we have. Item, another Zukin. We're doing this all week now. No. When he is bound at your sword and stands against you, waiting for you to withdraw from his sword, pretend to do a Zukin. However, stand a sword and only jerk your sword halfway backward and thrust immediately again to his face or his chest. If you're not able to hit him properly with the thrust, continue your work with a duplier or any other piece which you deem appropriate. All right, so this is a situation that feels happens a lot. So I love the mockery afterward. So we're here in a bind, no one's really doing anything, right? I might be pushing, he may be pushing back, or we're stuck neutral, and he's waiting for me to do something, right? So this is when the loss talks about he's waiting to do a knock rise in or an onset in as I move. If I try to do anything at all to disengage, he's just gonna drive through, turn a thrust in, and things like that. Even if I do a, right? Because he's still putting pressure towards me, even if I try to do a Dirk Vexel, right, he starts to press in and do things I don't want. So I'm going to give him something that he thinks he wants, right? I'm going to pull my sword, only half the blade, but I'm going to make him think I'm doing this, right? So that's a full Dirk Vexel. Instead, I'm going to do this, and then just thrust back in the same spot, the same opening. Because if you're reacting, so react against the full, right? If I come here, he's coming in, maybe I can just stab him a little bit because he's suicidal with that action. I'm still getting hit really hard. However, if he just thinks I'm doing that, I can very easily put this back in, cover myself if I need to against his attack, and really keep myself safe and keep him tricked. Just for thoroughness, doing the other, where I disengage but don't fully leave. If I come here, and yeah, no, that was perfect. It's very convincing. Well, there you go. That clearly doesn't work. But if I pull that, wow. Yeah, I'm sold.
That works.
So yeah, fairly convincing. Zukin means pulling towards your body, pulling along the path of the blade, at least until something else shows up and says otherwise. I'm gonna check time real quick. All right, I'm going to wrap up there. The next section gets into Dirklaufen, which is definitely longer than we have time for tonight. So we're gonna wrap it up. As always, I'm definitely open to input, feedback, comments, questions, critiques, whatever. Feel free to reach out, comment below, ask us on Historical Weapons Guild on Facebook, send us an email, anything like that. I'm happy to talk about these things, discuss them, and trade videos, whatever you guys want. Otherwise, as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Wednesday night, we're back with more mixed weapon madness that I come up with. And otherwise, have a great night.